In the spring of 1917, the city of Zurich was a strange island of calm in a continent on fire. While millions of men were dying in the trenches of France and the frozen plains of Galicia, Switzerland remained stubbornly neutral. In the narrow, cobblestone streets of the old town, life continued with a surreal normality. The shops were open, the electric lights burned brightly at night, and the international mail service still functioned. In a cramped, one-room apartment at number 14 Spiegelgasse, a Russian exile was living in near poverty. He was 46 years old. He lodged with his wife above a shoemaker's shop. The air in the room was thick with the smell of old sausage and the chemicals used to treat leather from the workshop downstairs. This was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known to the underground socialist movement as Lenin. At this moment in history, Lenin was an isolated political theorist who spent his days arguing with fellow exiles in the Zurich Public Library. He felt that his life's work was stagnating. Just weeks earlier, in January 1917, he had given a lecture to a group of young socialists in which he sounded resigned to dying in obscurity. He told them that while the older generation might not live to see the decisive battles of the coming revolution, he hoped the youth would. On the morning of March 15th, everything changed. A Polish friend rushed into the apartment on Spiegelgasse, breathless with excitement. He shouted that there was news from Russia. The telegrams were confirming the impossible. A revolution had broken out in Petrograd, the Tsar had abdicated, the ministers had been arrested. The Romanov dynasty, which Lenin had dedicated his entire life to destroying, had collapsed. For Lenin, the news was a shock of pure adrenaline, followed immediately by a crushing sense of despair. The event he had predicted for 20 years was finally happening, but it was happening 2,000 miles away, and he was watching it from a window in Switzerland. He realized immediately that he had to get back to Petrograd. Every day he spent in Zurich was a day the revolution was being shaped by liberals and moderates whom he despised. But he was trapped. Switzerland was geographically landlocked in the center of the Great War. To the north and east lay the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. To the west lay the French Republic. All of them were at war. The Allies, Britain and France, controlled the sea routes. They would never allow Lenin to pass because they knew he was an anti-war radical who wanted to pull Russia out of the conflict. If he tried to travel through France, he would be arrested. The Central Powers, Germany and Austria, were technically his enemies. If he crossed their borders, he risked being interned as a hostile alien. In his desperation, Lenin began to pace his small room like a caged animal. He concocted escape plans that bordered on the absurd. He wrote a letter to a colleague suggesting that they could hire a private airplane to fly over the front lines, ignoring the fact that aviation technology was in its infancy and they would likely be shot down by anti-aircraft fire. He then proposed forging a Swedish passport. When his wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, pointed out that he did not speak a word of Swedish, Lenin suggested that he could pretend to be a deaf mute to avoid having to speak to border guards. Krupskaya dismissed the idea immediately. She told him that he would inevitably fall asleep on the train and start shouting about politics in Russian during a nightmare, giving the game away. Lenin realized that disguises and airplanes were fantasies. There was only one realistic way back to Russia. He would have to do the unthinkable. He would have to negotiate a deal with the German government to let him travel across their territory. It was a decision that carried immense political risk. If he accepted help from the Kaiser, he would be branded a traitor and a German spy by his enemies. But if he stayed in Zurich, he would remain a nobody. Vladimir Lenin decided to risk his reputation and his life on a train. Part 1. The Hanging That Created a Revolutionary. To appreciate the magnitude of the journey Vladimir Lenin was about to undertake in 1917, it is necessary to look back 30 years to the event that shattered his childhood and forged his worldview. Before he was Lenin, he was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, born in April 1870 in the provincial city of Simbirsk on the banks of the Volga River. His background was the very definition of comfortable, middle-class respectability. His father, Ilya Ulyanov, was a high-ranking official in the Ministry of Education, a director of schools who had been granted the title of hereditary nobleman by the Tsar. The Ulyanov family was conservative, religious, and loyal to the regime. Vladimir grew up in a large wooden house with servants, playing the piano and excelling in his studies. He was a noisy, boisterous child with red hair and a sharp intellect, but there was no sign of the revolutionary zealot he would later become. The trajectory of his life changed forever in 1887. Vladimir was 17 years old. His older brother, Alexander, known to the family as Sasha, was studying biology at St. Petersburg University. Alexander was the golden child of the family, a brilliant student who won gold medals for his scientific research on worms. He was quiet, serious, and seemingly apolitical. However, unknown to his parents, Alexander had been drawn into the violent underground world of the People's Will, a terrorist organization dedicated to destroying the autocracy. In early 1887, Alexander and a small cell of conspirators decided to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. The plot was amateurish. Alexander, using his scientific training, manufactured bombs filled with nitroglycerin and lead pellets. To hide the explosives, he hollowed out a copy of a medical dictionary. The conspirators planned to throw the bombs at the Tsar's carriage on March 1st, the anniversary of the assassination of the previous Tsar. The secret police, the Okhrana, had been monitoring the group for weeks. They intercepted a letter sent by one of the conspirators, and the plot was dismantled before a single fuse could be lit. Alexander Ulyanov was arrested and thrown into the Peter and Paul fortress. The news devastated the Ulyanov family. In the conservative society of Simbirsk, they instantly became pariahs. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid speaking to the mother of a terrorist. Friends stopped visiting the house. Vladimir watched as the liberal society that his father had served turned its back on them completely. Alexander Ulyanov was given a chance to beg for mercy. If he had expressed remorse, his sentence might have been commuted to hard labor. But Alexander refused. He used his trial to deliver a political speech justifying the use of terror against a tyrannical regime. He told the court that there was no other way to fight a government that allowed no legal opposition. On May 8, 1887, Alexander Ulyanov was hanged in the courtyard of the Schlüsselburg fortress. He was 21 years old. The execution of his brother radicalized Vladimir. However, it did not turn him into a romantic terrorist like Alexander. Instead, it instilled in him a cold, hard pragmatism. According to family memoirists, including his younger sister Maria, Vladimir's reaction to the news was to declare that they would not go that way. He concluded that individual acts of terror were useless. Killing one Tsar simply meant that another would take his place. To change Russia, one had to destroy the entire system, not just the man at the top. Vladimir threw himself into the study of radical literature. He read the works of Karl Marx, finding in them a scientific explanation for the injustice he saw around him. He was expelled from Kazan University for participating in a minor student protest, an event that pushed him further into the underground. He eventually passed his law exams as an external student and moved to St. Petersburg in 1893. It was in the capital that he met the woman who would become his lifelong partner and political enforcer, Nadezhda Krupskaya. She was a dedicated Marxist teacher who ran evening classes for factory workers. Together, they organized strike committees and distributed illegal pamphlets. In December 1895, the police caught up with him. Vladimir was arrested and spent a year in prison before being exiled to Siberia for 3 years. The Siberian exile of the late 19th century was not the gulag system of the 20th century. It was a time of enforced boredom rather than slave labor. Vladimir was sent to the village of Shushenskoye in southern Siberia. He lived in a peasant hut, but he received a government allowance that permitted him to pay for room and board. When Krupskaya joined him, they hired a local girl to help with the housework. Vladimir spent his time hunting, playing chess, translating foreign socialist texts, and writing his own theories on the Russian economy. It was during this period of isolation that he began to use the pseudonym Lenin. Historians speculate that he chose the name after the Lena River in Siberia, following the tradition of revolutionaries taking names from the powerful natural forces of the Russian landscape. When his term of exile ended in 1900, Lenin emigrated to Western Europe. He would spend the next 17 years moving between Munich, London, Geneva, and Paris, living out of suitcases in cheap boarding houses. It was in these European cities that he began to build the machine that would eventually seize power. The defining moment of Lenin's political career, and the moment that explained why he was so isolated in 1917, occurred in 1903. The Russian Social Democratic Labour Party held its second Congress. Due to police pressure, the Congress began in a rat-infested flour warehouse in Brussels before moving to a church in London. The Congress was intended to unite the various strands of Russian Marxism into a single, cohesive party. Instead, it tore the movement apart. The split was not over the ultimate goal of the revolution. Everyone agreed that the Tsar must fall and socialism must rise. The split was over the nature of the party itself. Julius Martov, an old friend of Lenin, proposed a model based on the large, open socialist parties of Western Europe. He argued that anyone who supported the party's program and paid dues should be considered a member. He wanted a broad church that included workers, intellectuals, and sympathizers. Lenin violently disagreed. He argued that under the repressive conditions of the Russian police state, a broad, open party was a liability. It would be infiltrated by spies and diluted by waverers. Lenin demanded a party of professional revolutionaries. He wanted a small, tightly disciplined vanguard of men who devoted their entire lives to the cause. He famously stated that he did not want a debating society. He wanted an organization of agents who would obey orders from the center like a military unit. The debate in the sweltering London church became vicious. Old friendships were destroyed. When the vote was finally taken on the structure of the party editorial board, Lenin's faction won by a tiny margin, largely because some of the Jewish delegates and moderate socialists had walked out in protest earlier in the day. Seizing upon this momentary numerical advantage, Lenin immediately branded his faction the Bolsheviks, a word derived from the Russian word bolshinstvo, meaning majority. He labeled Martov's faction the Mensheviks, from menshinstvo, meaning minority. It was a brilliant act of political branding. For the rest of history, Lenin's group would be known as the majority, even though for most of the years leading up to 1917, they were actually the minority within the socialist movement. The split of 1903 revealed Lenin's essential character. He was a man of absolute, unyielding dogmatism. He viewed compromise as betrayal. In his mind, there were no shades of grey. You were either a disciplined revolutionary, totally obedient to the Central Committee, or you were an enemy. He was willing to split the party, purge his friends, and reduce his following to a tiny sect, provided that sect was pure and followed his command. This was the man who sat in Zurich in 1917, the leader of a radical splinter group. Most European socialists viewed him as a dangerous fanatic, a man who argued over obscure points of doctrine while the world was at war. He had spent years in the political wilderness, writing ferocious articles that few people read. But Lenin possessed a clarity of vision that his rivals lacked. While the Mensheviks argued that Russia was not ready for socialism and needed to pass through a phase of bourgeois democracy, Lenin believed the war had created a unique opportunity to smash the entire capitalist order. He was a man waiting for a weapon. In the spring of 1917, the German General Staff decided to give him one. Part 2. The Deal with the Devil. By March 1917, the German General Staff was facing a strategic nightmare. The war had dragged on for nearly 3 years, bleeding the nation dry. On the Western Front, the German army was locked in a deadly stalemate with the British and French. Across the Atlantic, the United States was preparing to enter the conflict, which would tip the balance of industrial power decisively against Germany. The German commanders, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff, knew that their only hope for victory lay in closing the Eastern Front immediately. If they could knock Russia out of the war, they could transfer hundreds of thousands of experienced troops to the west and launch a knockout blow against Paris before the Americans arrived. The fall of the Tsar in February had given them a glimmer of hope. However, that hope was quickly dashed. The new provisional government in Petrograd, led by liberals and moderate socialists, had declared that they would honor Russia's alliances. They vowed to fight the war to a victorious conclusion. For Germany, this was the worst possible outcome. They were facing a Russia that was now more democratic and potentially more energized by the revolution. It was in this context that a shadow figure emerged from the periphery of European politics to offer the Germans a solution. His name was Alexander Pavus. Pavus was one of the most enigmatic and colorful characters of the revolutionary underground. Born Israel Gelfand in the Pale of Settlement, he had been a brilliant Marxist theorist in his youth. He had mentored Leon Trotsky during the 1905 revolution, but Pavus had a taste for luxury that did not fit well with the ascetic lifestyle of a socialist. After 1905, he had moved to Constantinople and reinvented himself as an arms dealer and a merchant. By 1917, Pavus was a man of immense wealth and immense physical bulk. He was obese, often described as resembling a bulldog, with hanging jowls and tiny, sharp eyes. He lived in a suite at the finest hotel in Copenhagen, smoking expensive cigars and surrounded by a retinue of blonde secretaries. While he still claimed to be a socialist, his primary loyalty was to his own bank account and, increasingly, to the German Empire. Pavus acted as the bridge between the German Foreign Ministry and the Russian revolutionary movement. He approached the German ambassador in Copenhagen with a bold proposition. He argued that guns and artillery alone would not defeat Russia. To destroy the Russian army, Germany needed to destroy the Russian state from within. He pitched a plan that was essentially a form of biological warfare. He suggested that the German government should facilitate the return of the most radical anti-war exiles currently trapped in Switzerland. He specifically named Vladimir Lenin. Pavus argued that Lenin was a fanatic who would accept no compromise. If he returned to Petrograd, he would agitate against the provisional government, demand an immediate end to the war, and sow chaos in the army. Pavus famously described Lenin and his Bolsheviks as a plague bacillus that should be injected into the body of the Russian state to infect it. The German Foreign Office was intrigued. They forwarded the proposal to the High Command. General Ludendorff, a rigid militarist who despised socialists, looked at the plan with purely tactical eyes. He did not care about the long-term political consequences of unleashing communism. He simply wanted to win the war. He reportedly said that he did not know who this Mr. Lenin was, but if he could help defeat Russia, he should be sent at once. The Kaiser himself signed off on the operation. However, the Germans faced a problem. Lenin was not a man who could be easily bought. When Pavus tried to contact Lenin directly in Zurich, Lenin refused to see him. Lenin knew Pavus's reputation as a German agent and a war profiteer. He knew that if he was seen shaking hands with Pavus, his political credibility in Russia would be destroyed. He would be branded a traitor before he even crossed the border. Lenin was desperate to get home, but he was terrified of the optics. He spent days agonizing over the decision. He knew that traveling through enemy territory during wartime was technically treason. If the provisional government found out he had made a deal with the Kaiser, they would arrest him and likely hang him. To solve this dilemma, Lenin devised a strategy of aggressive legalism. He would travel through Germany, but he would do so on his own terms. He refused to negotiate directly with the German officials. Instead, he appointed a neutral intermediary to handle the dirty work. He chose Fritz Platen, a dedicated Swiss socialist who was a great admirer of Lenin. Platen was tasked with approaching the German ambassador in Bern, Count Romberg, to negotiate the specific conditions of the transit. Lenin drafted a set of demands that were breathtaking in their arrogance. He was a penniless refugee dictating terms to the most powerful military machine on earth. First, Lenin demanded that the train carriage carrying the exiles must be granted extraterritorial status. This was a legal fiction usually reserved for embassies. It meant that technically the carriage would not be on German soil. It would be a moving island of neutrality. Second, he demanded that there would be no passport control and no inspection of luggage. The Germans would have no right to see who was on the train or what documents they were carrying. This was crucial for Lenin, as he did not want the Germans to know exactly which revolutionaries were accompanying him, nor did he want them reading his papers. Third, he insisted that no German official could enter the carriage during the journey. The exiles would be accompanied by 2 German officers who would act as escorts, but these officers were to be confined to a rear compartment. A physical barrier would be established to separate the Russians from the Germans. There was to be absolutely no communication between the two groups. Finally, Lenin insisted that he and his companions would pay for their own tickets. They would pay third-class fares, calculated at the standard rate. This was a vital piece of political theatre. Lenin needed to be able to say that he had not taken German money. He wanted to be able to claim that he was simply a passenger purchasing a service, not a hired agent. The German ambassador forwarded these demands to Berlin. The Foreign Office was stunned by the audacity of the Russian exile, but the pressure from the High Command was intense. They wanted the bacillus in Petrograd as soon as possible. Berlin accepted all of Lenin's conditions. The agreement was signed by Fritz Platen and the German representatives. It was a document unique in the history of diplomacy. It transformed a railway carriage into a sealed diplomatic vessel. Lenin began to assemble his traveling party. He was ruthless in his selection. He invited only those Bolsheviks he trusted implicitly, along with a few members of other socialist factions to provide political cover. The final list included 32 adults and 2 children. Among them were his wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, and his close confidant and former lover, Inessa Armand. Also on the list was Grigory Zinoviev, Lenin's closest lieutenant in exile, and Karl Radech, a brilliant but erratic Austrian Marxist who travelled on a forged Austrian permit. Lenin was preparing for the journey with the meticulousness of a general preparing for battle. He spent his final days in Zurich sorting through his papers, burning letters that might compromise his contacts, and packing his meagre belongings. He was fully aware of the gamble he was taking. He told his friends that he estimated their chances of being arrested by the provisional government upon arrival in Russia were extremely high. He told them they would likely be taken straight from the train to the Peter and Paul fortress. But the lure of the revolution was too strong. The deal with the devil had been struck. The Germans had provided the train, Parvus had provided the logistics, and Lenin had provided the ruthless will to use the enemy for his own ends. On the morning of April 9, 1917, the group gathered at the Zeringen Hotel in Zurich for a final meal of soup and bread. Then, carrying their pillows and baskets of food, they walked to the central station to board the train that would change the course of the 20th century. Part 3. The Sealed Wagon. On the morning of April 9, 1917, the small group of revolutionaries gathered for a final meal at the Zeringen Hotel in Zurich. They ate a simple lunch of soup and bread, signed their names to a document acknowledging that they were taking full responsibility for the journey, and then walked to the central railway station. The scene on the platform was chaotic and hostile. The news of Lenin's deal with the German government had spread through the Russian exile community. Dozens of rival socialists, Mensheviks and social revolutionaries had gathered to protest the departure. They surrounded the train, shouting insults at the passengers. They called them spies, traitors and agents of the Kaiser. One angry protester shouted that Lenin was going back to Russia to murder the revolution. Ryazanov, a prominent socialist, yelled that Lenin was a madman who would ruin the entire movement. Lenin ignored them. He grabbed the arm of a worker who was standing nearby and pulled him onto the train to hear a final explanation of why they were leaving, only to release him just before the whistle blew. As the train began to pull away from the station at 3:10 in the afternoon, the jeers of the crowd faded, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of the wheels. Contrary to the popular myth, the famous sealed train was not a windowless freight wagon. It was a standard green-painted passenger carriage, comprising a mix of second-class and third-class compartments. It was attached to the back of a regular Swiss train for the first leg of the journey to the German border. Inside the carriage were 32 Russians. Among them were 19 Bolsheviks, 6 members of the Jewish Bund, and a handful of children. The passengers included Lenin, his wife Nadezhda Krupskaya, his close friend Inessa Armand, Grigory Zinoviev with his wife and young son, and the erratic Austrian Marxist Karl Radech. The group reached the German border station of Gottmardingen later that afternoon. Here, the unique legal status of the journey was put to the test. The Swiss customs officials disembarked and the German military authorities took over. The carriage was shunted onto a German locomotive. This was the moment the train became sealed. It was not sealed physically. The windows were not boarded up, although the blinds were drawn at night. It was sealed legally. Under the terms of the agreement negotiated by Fritz Platen, no German official had the right to enter the compartments occupied by the Russians. To enforce this separation, Fritz Platen drew a line on the floor of the corridor with a piece of white chalk. This line represented the border between the Russian extraterritorial zone and the German Empire. On one side of the chalk line were the 32 revolutionaries. On the other side were two German officers, Captain von Plamitz and Lieutenant von Boering, who had been assigned to escort the train to the Baltic coast. These officers sat in the rear compartment, effectively quarantined from their cargo. They had orders to ensure the train was given priority clearance at all stations and to prevent any civilians from trying to board. As the train moved deeper into Germany, the atmosphere inside the carriage was a strange mix of high tension and domestic comedy. Lenin was terrified that the Germans might change their minds. He worried that the train would be diverted to a prisoner of war camp, or that the German High Command would try to use them for propaganda purposes by forcing them to meet with German officials. To minimize the risk, Lenin imposed a regime of strict discipline. He treated the single railway carriage as a microcosm of the state he hoped to build. He appointed captains to oversee the logistics and behavior of the passengers. The most pressing issue, as it turned out, was cigarette smoke. Many of the revolutionaries were heavy smokers, but Lenin despised the smell of tobacco. He banned smoking in the compartments and the corridors. The only place smoking was permitted was in the lavatory at the end of the carriage. This created a logistical bottleneck. The smokers crowded into the small toilet, occupying it for hours, which led to complaints from the passengers who actually needed to use the facilities for their intended purpose. Lenin solved this problem with a bureaucratic solution that foreshadowed his future style of government. He cut up pieces of paper and issued tickets. There were two types of tickets: first-class tickets for those with urgent biological needs and second-class tickets for smokers. A person holding a first-class ticket had priority over a smoker. This system restored order, although it led to grumbling among the nicotine-starved Bolsheviks. While Lenin tried to maintain discipline, the chaotic element on the train was Karl Radek. Radek was a brilliant journalist and a dedicated revolutionary, but he was also a prankster who refused to take anything seriously. While Lenin sat working quietly on his papers, Radek told dirty jokes, teased the children, and generally disrupted the solemn atmosphere. Radek was also a source of anxiety because he was technically an Austrian subject. Since Austria was Germany's ally, Radek was liable for military service. If the German authorities discovered him on the train, they could legally arrest him as a deserter. Throughout the journey, the other passengers tried to hide Radek whenever the train stopped, but he refused to stay hidden. The journey provided the Russians with a grim window into the reality of the war from the German side. As they looked out the windows, they did not see the militaristic juggernaut they expected. They saw a country on the brink of starvation. 1917 was the year of the turnip winter in Germany. The British naval blockade had cut off food imports, and the potato crop had failed. At the stations where the train stopped to take on water, the Russians saw the faces of the German people. They were gaunt, pale, and exhausted. There were no men of military age to be seen, only women, children, and the elderly. The Russians, ironically, were better fed than the Germans. They had brought baskets of food from Switzerland. In a gesture of solidarity, some of the Bolsheviks tried to throw leftover crusts of bread out of the windows to some French prisoners of war working on the tracks near Stuttgart. The German guards immediately intervened and threatened to board the train if the Russians did not stop feeding the prisoners. The most dangerous moment of the journey occurred in the city of Frankfurt. The train was held at the station for a prolonged stop. The platform was crowded with German soldiers waiting for transport to the front and local workers. The terms of the sealed agreement stated strictly that there was to be no communication between the passengers and the German population. But Karl Radek, bored and reckless, lowered the window of his compartment. He saw a group of German soldiers standing nearby. He leaned out and shouted a greeting, asking them about the war. The soldiers, surprised to hear someone speaking German from the mysterious carriage, walked over. Radek began to engage them in conversation. He asked them why they were still fighting for the Kaiser. He started to agitate, attempting to spread revolutionary propaganda right there on the platform in Frankfurt. The two German escort officers, Captain von Planitz and Lieutenant von Boring, were horrified. They rushed from their compartment, crossing the chalk line in their panic. They physically pulled Radek back inside and slammed the window shut. They drew the blinds and threatened to arrest the entire group if such an incident happened again. Lenin was furious with Radek, reprimanding him severely for endangering the entire mission for the sake of a joke. The train continued north, passing through Berlin. It was routed around the center of the capital to avoid attention. There had been rumors that members of the German Socialist Party, or perhaps even trade union leaders, might try to board the train to meet Lenin. Lenin had given strict orders that no one was to be allowed on board. He knew that if he was seen talking to a German socialist who supported the war effort, his reputation in Russia would be ruined. He had to remain pure, uncompromised, and independent. In Berlin, the train was delayed for nearly 20 hours. The reasons for this delay remain a subject of historical speculation. Some historians suggest that the German High Command was debating whether to let them proceed. Others believe it was simply a logistical hold-up in the overstretched wartime rail network. For the passengers, it was a time of intense anxiety. They sat in the siding, unable to leave the carriage, wondering if the deal had been cancelled. Finally, the train began to move again. It headed north toward the Baltic coast. On the morning of April 12th, they reached the port of Sassnitz. This was the end of the line for the sealed train. The carriage had served its purpose. The group disembarked, stiff and tired after 3 days of travel. They were escorted to the passenger ferry Queen Victoria, which ran the route between Germany and Sweden. As they walked up the gangplank, they were leaving the territory of the Central Powers. The German officers, von Planitz and von Boring, stayed on the pier. They watched the ship depart. They had fulfilled their orders. They had successfully transported the plague bacillus across the German Empire without infection. They likely believed that they had just struck a blow for the German war effort. They could not have known that by delivering this small group of radicals to the north, they had set in motion a chain of events that would eventually destroy the German Empire as well. On board the ferry, the tension evaporated. The Russians were effectively free. They raided the ship's buffet, gorging themselves on a smorgasbord of Swedish food, which seemed like a banquet after the meager rations of the journey. Lenin, however, did not relax. He spent the crossing interrogating the other passengers about the political situation in Sweden and Finland. He was already planning his next move. When the ferry docked in Trelleborg, Sweden, late that evening, they were met by the mayor of the town, who was a socialist sympathizer. For the first time in days, they could walk freely on the ground without fear of arrest. Lenin was quiet, his mind already projecting forward to the Russian border. The sealed wagon was behind them, but the true journey was just beginning. Part 4. The arrival at Finland Station. The train arrived in Stockholm on the morning of April 13, 1917. For the first time in 3 days, the travellers could breathe freely. Sweden was neutral ground, far away from the chalk lines and the German officers. The group was met on the platform by a delegation of Swedish socialists led by the mayor of Stockholm, Carl Lindhagen. They adjourned to the Hotel Regina for breakfast. It was a strange sight. The 32 revolutionaries, dishevelled and smelling of stale train smoke, sat in the opulent dining room surrounded by the polite society of the Swedish capital. Lenin, usually indifferent to his surroundings, was focused entirely on the next leg of the journey. He immediately began devouring the Swedish newspapers, looking for the latest intelligence from Petrograd. However, his lieutenant, Karl Radek, had a different priority. Radek was concerned with optics. He looked at Lenin and realized that the future leader of the Russian Revolution looked like a vagrant. Lenin was wearing a battered coat and a pair of heavy hobnailed mountain boots that he had used for hiking in the Swiss Alps. Radek argued that if Lenin wanted to be taken seriously by the Russian people and the Petrograd Soviet, he could not arrive looking like a peasant. Lenin initially resisted, dismissing clothes as bourgeois trivialities. But Radek persisted, and eventually the group made a trip to a department store in the center of Stockholm. They bought Lenin a new pair of shoes to replace the mountain boots. Radek tried to convince him to buy a new overcoat and extra underwear, but Lenin refused, declaring that he had spent enough money. He did, however, agree to buy a new hat. He purchased a standard heavy worker's cap, the kind that would become iconic in thousands of statues and posters for the next 70 years. This brief shopping trip was the only concession Lenin made to his personal comfort. He spent the rest of the day in meetings, organizing communications and sending telegrams. He sent a message to the Bolsheviks in Petrograd. Arriving Monday night, 11 p.m., tell Pravda. On the evening of April 13th, the group boarded the night train north. They traveled for a full day through the snow-covered forests of Sweden, heading toward the Arctic Circle. Their destination was the town of Haparanda, on the border with the Russian Grand Duchy of Finland. The border crossing was not a simple checkpoint. The railway line ended on the Swedish side. Separating Sweden from Russian-controlled Finland was the Torn River, which was frozen solid. To cross the border, the passengers had to disembark and travel across the ice. It was a stark, dramatic scene. Under a pale grey sky, the revolutionaries piled their luggage onto horse-drawn sleighs. Wrapped in blankets against the biting wind, they were driven across the frozen river. Lenin sat in one of the sleighs, a small figure in a dark coat, physically crossing the boundary between the West and the empire he intended to destroy. On the other side, in the town of Tornio, they faced their first real test. This was Russian territory. The border guards were technically under the authority of the provisional government. Lenin was convinced that this was where the trap would snap shut. He expected to be arrested for treason immediately. The British officers stationed at the border post to monitor travellers were suspicious. They took the group into a holding room and subjected them to a rigorous search. They stripped the men naked, checking for secret documents or German gold. They interrogated them about their journey through Germany. Lenin endured the humiliation with a cold, simmering fury. However, the provisional government had not issued an arrest warrant. Despite the rumors, the new government was so committed to civil liberties that they felt they could not bar a Russian citizen from returning home, even one as dangerous as Lenin. After several tense hours, the border guards stamped their papers. They were free to go. They boarded a Russian train for the final leg of the journey through Finland. As they moved south toward Petrograd, the tension on the train began to shift from fear to anticipation. At the station of Belustrov, just outside the capital, the train was boarded by a delegation of senior Bolsheviks who had come out to meet their leader. Among them were Lev Kamenev and Joseph Stalin, who had recently returned from their own exile in Siberia. The reunion was not entirely warm. Lenin did not waste time with pleasantries. He immediately launched into a political attack. He had read the recent issues of Pravda, the party newspaper that Kamenev and Stalin were editing. He was furious. The paper had been publishing articles advocating for cooperation with the provisional government and suggesting that the war should continue to defend the revolution. Lenin berated Kamenev in the carriage, demanding to know what he was writing. He told him that the war was an imperialist slaughter and that the Bolsheviks should have nothing to do with the new government. The other passengers watched in silence. They realized that Lenin had not come back to join the revolution. He had come back to hijack it. As the train approached Petrograd, the anxiety returned. Lenin asked the Bolsheviks on board if they would be arrested when they arrived at the station. The delegates smiled nervously. They told him that arrest was unlikely. They said, "The workers have prepared a welcome." Lenin did not know what that meant. He expected a small group of party loyalists, perhaps a few dozen friends. He imagined he would slip into a taxi and go to his sister's apartment. The train pulled into the Finland Station at 10 minutes past 11 on the night of April 16, 1917. The scene that awaited them was overwhelming. The station was blazing with light. The Bolshevik organizers had flooded the platform with searchlights taken from the nearby Peter and Paul fortress. Giant red and gold triumphal arches had been erected on the platform. The moment the train stopped, a military band struck up La Marseillaise, the anthem of the revolution. A guard of honor, composed of sailors from the Kronstadt naval base, stood at attention, their bayonets gleaming under the arc lights. Lenin stepped off the train. He was stunned. He was immediately engulfed by a crowd of soldiers and workers. They hoisted him onto their shoulders and carried him through the station. They threw bouquets of red roses at him. The man who had been living in a shoemaker's house in Zurich 3 days earlier was now being treated like a conquering emperor. However, the political establishment was waiting to try and tame him. Inside the station, in the opulent imperial waiting room, formerly reserved for the Tsar, the leaders of the Petrograd Soviet were gathered. They were Mensheviks, the moderate socialists who believed in working with the provisional government. Their leader was Nikolai Chekhaidze, a gloomy former schoolteacher. Chekhaidze had prepared a speech designed to neutralize Lenin. As Lenin walked into the waiting room, looking small and ill at ease in his new suit and holding a bouquet of roses that looked like a burden, Chekhaidze stopped him. Instead of a warm welcome, Chekhaidze delivered a lecture. He told Lenin that the most important task for the revolution now was unity. He said that the working class needed to stand together to defend their gains against counter-revolution. He finished by saying, "We hope that you will pursue these goals together with us." It was a clear warning. Do not rock the boat. Do not cause trouble. Lenin's reaction was a piece of calculated theatricality that signaled the end of the old socialist order. He did not look at Chekhaidze. He acted as if the man did not exist. He looked up at the ceiling. He looked at the crowd surrounding them. He adjusted his tie. When Chekhaidze finished speaking, Lenin turned his back on him completely. He faced the doors of the waiting room, where a crowd of soldiers and sailors was pressing in. He addressed them, ignoring the official welcoming committee entirely. He said, "Dear comrades, soldiers, sailors, and workers, I am happy to greet in you the victorious Russian Revolution. The piratical imperialist war is the beginning of civil war throughout Europe." He continued, his voice rising. "The hour is not far off when, at the summons of our comrade Karl Liebknecht, the people will turn their weapons against their own capitalist exploiters. The worldwide socialist revolution has already dawned. Germany is seething. Any day now, the whole of European capitalism may crash. The Russian Revolution accomplished by you has prepared the way and opened a new epoch. Long live the worldwide socialist revolution." The room went silent. The Mensheviks were horrified. Lenin was not talking about unity or defense. He was talking about a global civil war. He was praising Germany, the enemy nation, as the next site of revolution. He was declaring war on the very concept of the provisional government. Lenin pushed his way out of the waiting room and into the square outside the station. The scene was chaotic. Thousands of workers filled the plaza. The Bolsheviks had organized a fleet of armored cars to escort him. Lenin climbed onto the hood of one of the armored cars. Standing in the glare of the searchlights, he delivered another speech to the massive crowd. He denounced the capitalist ministers of the government. He told the soldiers to stop fighting the war. He told the peasants to seize the land. This was the moment the Russian Revolution split in two. Until that night, the revolution had been about democracy, about getting rid of the Tsar and becoming a normal European country like France or Britain. In the space of 1 hour at the Finland Station, Lenin changed the narrative. He declared that the February Revolution was just the first step and that the real revolution, the socialist revolution, was yet to come. The armored car eventually moved off, leading a procession through the streets to the Bolshevik headquarters at the Kashisinskaya mansion. The mansion had belonged to Matilda Kashisinskaya, the Tsar's former mistress and a prima ballerina. It was a symbol of pure imperial decadence, now occupied by the most radical party in Russia. Inside the mansion, Lenin sat down to a tea of black bread and herring. He was exhausted, but he could not sleep. He began to write. He drafted a document that would become known as the April Theses. It was a blueprint for the total destruction of the Russian state. It called for no support for the provisional government, the abolition of the police and the army, the confiscation of all estates, and the nationalization of all banks. When he presented these ideas to his own party the next day, they were stunned. Even his closest supporters thought he had gone mad. They thought he had been out of the country too long and did not understand the reality of Russia. One prominent Bolshevik, Alexander Bogdanov, shouted that Lenin's speech was the raving of a madman. But Lenin was not mad. He was the only one who understood the true fragility of the situation. He knew that the people were tired of the war and that the government could not deliver peace. He knew that whoever promised peace would eventually win. The sealed train had delivered its payload. The gamble taken by the German General Staff had paid off beyond their wildest dreams. They had sent a man to disrupt the Russian war effort, but they had unleashed a force that would eventually sweep away not just the Russian government, but the German Empire as well. The bacillus had arrived, and the infection would be fatal. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.